Thank you very much. And can I just start off by welcoming everyone to Parliament Buildings. I'm sure most of you have been here before, but you're very welcome nevertheless for this Knowledge Exchange seminar. As Fiona said, my name is Alistair Ross. I chair the Justice Seminar, the Justice Committee here at Stormont, and I'm particularly pleased to be here, not just because it gets me out of canvassing today before the election tomorrow, but because youth justice is an area that I have been particularly interested in since taking up post almost 4 months ago. Indeed, last month I launched my own initiative of justice seminars, the aim of which is to create the space for us outside of the normal committee business to have innovative thinking and fresh ideas within the criminal justice system in Northern Ireland. And we want to see ultimately a criminal justice system which is fairer, which is quicker, which is more accessible, and ultimately one which makes us all safer by protecting the public and rehabilitating offenders. And I was truly delighted the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Declan Morgan, agreed to be the first keynote speaker at the seminars, and he examined the whole area of youth justice, pointing to the youth triage system that is used in Hull and that perhaps we could learn from, and the committee would be keen to go over and engage with the people who are behind that scheme. And also he posed questions about our whole approach towards youth justice and how we deal with young people in the criminal justice system. The idea behind the Justice Seminars is not only to encourage innovative thinking, but also to encourage greater collaboration between politicians, between academics, and between the stakeholders in the legal profession, the judiciary, and of course the key stakeholders in the community and voluntary sector as well. And I think that's why these knowledge exchange seminars can be of great value. And perhaps some of you attending this afternoon may be interested in attending some of the justice seminars in the future as well. And if you do wish to do so, just contact the committee office, and I'm sure we'll make an invitation accessible to you, because in the future the Bar Council, the Law Society, the Attorney General will all leading discussions on the area of youth justice in the number of seminars that we have before the summer recess. But as well as the research work and the findings that academics do, it helps us very much in the political world, as Fiona had said earlier, have an evidence-based approach to policy making. And at the launch of the seminars a few weeks ago, I challenged politicians to think differently, not to judge ideas based on whether it's seen as being tough on law and order or soft on crime, but rather on whether it works or it doesn't work. And in youth justice in particular, I think there's strong evidence to suggest that not only do we need to dramatically speed up the process from the time where the alleged offence takes place to the time where a decision is taken on how that young person pays back their debt to society, but also in terms of the people who young people will deal with in the criminal justice system, whether that be police officers, whether it be lawyers, judges, and how they can communicate effectively with young people. And finally, how we can utilise diversions and interventions better, and perhaps restorative measures where and when appropriate. It's about finding the most appropriate and proportionate way of dealing with young people, and sometimes the worst thing that we can do is actually to put young people into the formal criminal justice system, because it only adds to this cycle and a dangerous cycle in their lives. So what I, as chairman of the committee, am keen to do over the next number of months is to identify what early interventions in education or health could help identify the young people most at risk of offending, what work programmes we can have and offer offenders to pay back their debt to society in a meaningful way, yet at the same time equip them with skills that will help them find employment and turn their lives around, and how sports organisations in Northern Ireland can work in conjunction with government to help young people out of trouble, teach them values in an alternative, non-threatening way, and how the right interventions or diversions can actually save the public purse in the long term by keeping people out of prison and off welfare. That work is obviously ongoing, and I hope, as I said, many of you may want to engage in that work in the future. I think it's the more people that we can get engaged in that, the better. But of course, the informal session, the committee is also doing a number of pieces of work in relation to youth justice. The committee has visited Woodlands Juvenile Justice Centre to meet with young people, talk with young people and explore the issues that they have. And during committee stage of the Justice Bill, we considered evidence from stakeholders on issues relating to the youth justice system, including addressing retention and disclosure of criminal records. And as part of our policy scrutiny, the Justice Committee was recently briefed by departmental officials on its consultation on statutory time limits in the youth courts. And again, it's something which the Lord Chief Justice touched on when he mentioned the work that's ongoing in Hull. So the committee has a long and an ongoing interest and work in a wide range of youth justice issues. I'm sure that if it wasn't for the election tomorrow, many more committee members would have been here this afternoon to engage with you. It's perhaps unfortunate they haven't, but I'm sure that they will wish to engage with you again in the future. And I want to make no more comment other than just to introduce our speakers today. And I have great pleasure in introducing them. First of all, we'll hear from Ms. Lesley Emerson, Dr. Karen Orr, and Professor Paul Connolly, all from Queen's, on their research entitled Engaging Young People with the Conflict and its Legacy, Findings from an Evaluation of the Prison to Peace Educational Programme. And then we'll hear a presentation from Dr. Nicola Carr and Dr. Siobhan McAllister, both from Queen's again, Experiencing Youth Justice Process, Meaning and Legitimacy. So again, welcome to Department Buildings. I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have after the presentations, and I'll hand over to Lesley and Karen. Thank you very much.
As you can see, what we're going to be talking about is findings from an evaluation that we conducted of an educational programme which sought to engage young people with the conflict and its legacy. And what I'm going to do is sort of set the scene, give you a flavour of what the programme consists of, and talk a little bit about the approach that we took to the evaluation before I hand over to Karen, who's going to talk about the findings. And then I'll come back again to the conclusions. Bit of a double act going on. Okay. I suppose the thing to set, it's important to set the context for this. What we were interested in is the idea of what is the role of education in transitional contexts as societies are moving from conflict to peace. What role does education play in that? And in some of the work that I had previously been involved in doing, I suppose what I was calling for was a more systemic approach to addressing the past and its legacy and engaging education in that. And one of the key things that we know is needed there is for young people to have a really full understanding of the complexity of conflict and the complexity of transition, is that they hear multiple narratives, they hear a wide range of different stories, what would be referred to in the literature around history education as polyvocal histories, and particularly those that are bottom-up, grassroots types of histories to augment official narratives that young people would potentially hear through the traditional history curriculum. So basically on the back of that, I was asked to work with an initiative called the Prison to Peace Initiative, which brings together the ex-prisoner organisations from the 5 main combatant groups involved in the conflict from loyalist and Republican backgrounds. And I was asked to work with them because the former prisoners felt that there was something in their stories, something in their journey from conflict to prison and ultimately into peace-building programmes that they felt young people could learn from. And they were particularly concerned at that initial stage of challenging young people who were maybe at risk of getting involved in residual violence. So they approached me and asked, as an education person, if I could help assist them in doing that in the formal school context. And out of that came a programme called From Prison to Peace, Learning from the Experience of Political Ex-Prisoners. And this programme was put together and aimed at 14 to 16-year-olds in the formal school setting as part of the history/citizenship curriculum. And one of the things that the programme aimed to do was to help engage young people with the complexity of conflict, to help them understand that perhaps the narratives that they had learnt from their own community were not the whole picture. And also to help them understand how difficult it is to shift from conflict to peace and some of the processes that are involved in transition, not just the elite processes, but some of the grassroots processes that need to be in place. And overall, the kind of thrust behind it was to try and help young people develop a capacity for political generosity, to understand their own perspective and where they're coming from, their own political identity, but to recognise the rights of others to hold the political identity that they hold. So the programme was developed. And then it was based on, I should have said, it's based on the narratives of 15 former loyalist and Republican prisoners. And it takes young people through from why people got involved in conflict to the prison experience and the reality of the prison experience, particularly the impact it's had on families and community, and then through to conflict transformation processes and community development. We were then very fortunate to get some funding from OFM DFM to conduct an evaluation of this programme. And our broad objectives were, if you look at the second one here, the broad objective was primarily to look at the impact that the programme might be having on young people's knowledge, attitudes and behaviours. As you can imagine, we're not shying away from the fact that this is a pretty controversial type of programme. To address issues of conflict from the point of view of those who were directly involved in it was controversial, and we really wanted to see what kind of impact it was having on young people. And we also wanted to engage with other stakeholders from a range of different communities and different educational communities, victim sector, etc., to see what their views were on how education should address issues of the past. The process that we went through, if I can just explain briefly what we did, the main process was a cluster randomised controlled trial. So basically what we did is we recruited 20 schools, and 10 of those schools were allocated to the intervention group, in other words, the group that we're going to run with the programme, and 10 of those schools were matched to those schools, but they were a control group. They were not involved in the programme. And what we were able to do is to measure through a survey the attitudes, intended behaviours and knowledge of the young people at the start of the programme, measure that again at the end of the programme, and to compare that with the control group to see if the programme had had any impact. And if you have any questions on the statistical processes involved in that, you can ask Karen. I do words, not numbers. So another element of this was case studies of schools. We're not going to talk about this bit of it today, but clearly the schools who were willing to engage in this programme were ready to deal with these types of controversies and were ready to engage their young people with these issues. So we were interested in what it was about these schools that were ready and prepared to take these risks. And we were also interested in how this type of programme might sit more broadly with a broad process to helping young people engage with the past. So we had a number of, there's a very large qualitative component to the research as well. But if I just go back to the quantitative bit of it, the measurements, it's important that we had identified from the outset what we thought the programme might achieve. And this was done in conjunction with those who were involved in the development of the programme, with some schools who had piloted the programme, and what we know from educational programmes and what they might achieve. And these were the broad outcomes that we were looking towards. We wanted to see if, out the other end of the programme, were young people more aware of how complex conflict was? Did it challenge the narratives that they had at the start? One of the ways that we did that, it's very hard to measure knowledge. How much do you know is really how much do you think you know. But one of the things that we did that Karen will be reporting on later is we asked a series of very simple questions. And one of the questions was to the young people, what do you think caused the troubles? And then we were able to match their answers at the start of the programme with their answers at the end of the programme to see how their understanding of the conflict here had changed. And Karen will be reporting on that later. We also wanted to increase their knowledge of the processes of transition, which I'd said, and then we wanted to look at how the programme might impact on their attitudes. Number 3 here, reduction in sectarian prejudice. At the outset, we put this down as exploratory only because we know in education that attitudes are really, really hard to shift. And it is, in our experience, highly unlikely that an 8 to 10 week programme is going to significantly shift young people's prejudices. Also, this programme didn't directly address sectarian prejudice. It looked at conflict and transition. It didn't do the usual dealing with diversity, looking at difference, understanding the differences within our community now. It was very much looking at the nature of conflict. So we put it in as exploratory only, and I suppose at those stages primarily to check that it wasn't increasing sectarian prejudice, because that would clearly be a negative thing. So we put in some measures. We can talk about those if anybody's interested in that and how we measured those things later. But we also wanted to increase respect for political diversity and acceptance of other political positions and opinions. And finally then, in terms of intended behaviours, particularly because we wanted young people to be challenged around the idea of support and use of violence to deal with division and conflict, we wanted to measure if that was being reduced. And also we hoped that at the other end of the programme, the young people would want to become more politically engaged. So we had a number of measures in around that. So that was the process that we went through, was to conduct this trial where we measured the young people's attitudes, knowledge and behaviours at the start and the end of the programme, alongside a lot of qualitative data to try and understand the processes that were happening. And Karen's going to now speak about the findings.
I'm going to talk you through some of the key findings from both the randomised control trial and the qualitative work. We're very deliberately not bombarding you with a whole load of numbers. I'm going to try and make it as meaningful as possible, but rest assured within the briefing that is in your pack, there are some numbers and some statistical information available. If anybody has any questions at the end or would like any further information, feel free to give us a shout. Okay, so first and foremost, in terms of the randomised control trial, off the bat, it had a positive effect. The measures we used, as Lesley explained, were looking at those key outcomes according to knowledge, attitudes and behaviour. And what we found that there was a statistically significant effect on these key issues. So it increased young people's knowledge of the conflict, processes of transition and conflict transformation. It increased their support for using non-violent means as a way of dealing with conflict. And as Lesley said, although we put in the prejudice item as being an exploratory measure, because we didn't think there was going to be any effect and we were testing to make sure it didn't actually have a negative effect, on the contrary, it actually reduced sectarian prejudice as well. And remember, these are significant effects and they are quite sizable in terms of their effects as well. And it also increased their likeliness of becoming politically engaged. And that was measured by looking at things like their likelihood to talk to their family or their teachers or their friends, their likelihood to gather information on political matters, and their likelihood to be engaged in democratic processes, for example, in their school environment. So overall, you can see it did have a positive effect on their knowledge, their attitudes and their behaviours. We also looked at direct participation in politics and respect for political, was that diversity, Lesley? Yeah? Yes. Yeah. But although these increases weren't significant, they were still there. It did increase their respect for political generosity and their participation in political issues, but this wasn't a significant finding. So overall, in a nutshell, it had a positive impact. So that was the randomised control trial. There was also certain things that we were just really interested to look at further. So one of the things we looked at was the complexity of the conflict. So like Lesley said, we had this open-ended response where we asked young people, what do you think caused the troubles? And they had a free response in this survey to type in absolutely anything that they wanted. Lesley and I had the lovely task of coding absolutely all of that to try and make sense of it. So we married up pre-test responses to post-test responses. So for those kids that went through the programme, before they went through the programme, and after they went through the programme, as well as those kids who were in the control schools who didn't have the programme at all, again, we married up their pre-test data with the post-test data, and we were able to do some sort of comparisons. So what we find is, in terms of those kids that were in the intervention schools, those kids that went through the Prison to Peace programme, after having gone through the programme, they were more likely to locate the troubles within a socio-political and historical context, whereas the kids in the intervention school were still as inclined to say things like, it was the Protestants' fault, it was the Catholics' fault. They were still inclined to just blame the other side. So it was much more simple rationale for what caused the conflict, whereas those kids that went through the programme tended to talk more about the socio-political issues. We also looked at this idea of optimism. We worked with a young person's advisory group in the development of this entire research project, actually, and they helped us develop the survey and develop the measures. And one of the things they really wanted us to add in was a question, do you think there'll ever be permanent peace? So we actually loved this data, but we can't take any sort of credit for it because it was the idea of the young people. But it was actually a really enlightening question, because those kids that didn't go through the programme, their answer stayed the same. So I think it was like 26% said yes before the programme, 27% said yes after the programme. The kids that did have the programme, theirs increased from 25% to 37%. So there was a significant difference between those kids at post-test of those who had had the programme and those who hadn't. So this sort of speaks to the capacity of a programme like this to maybe encourage a bit more optimism in our young people today, and that they can hope for some sort of permanent peace here in Northern Ireland. We also looked at some issues around trust. So we asked the young people how much they trusted the police, how much they trusted their politicians, how much they trusted the government, how much they trusted the media. And with the control schools, their trust levels all decreased, especially around the police. And to sort of caveat this, the time this trial was going on was in and around the flag protests. So there was a bit of a decrease amongst trust in the children who were in the control group. The kids in the intervention schools, their trust all increased. And there was a significant difference in terms of the response to the police question. So again, it speaks to the capacity of a programme like this to try and offer some sort of stability and trust in these sort of democratic processes that are going on around young people today. Now, one of the things we did look at was this idea of cultural identity, And there wasn't a change in this, but we look at this as very much a positive thing. The programme did not try and change a young person's cultural identity. If they seen themselves as a Protestant Unionist or a Nationalist Catholic and they stayed that way, then as far as we're concerned, that's good. You know, that was a positive finding for us. Like Lesley said, that it's really trying to increase this idea of political generosity, to be able to hold your own cultural identity and your own viewpoint, but have the capacity to appreciate and respect the opposite of other young people. So that might look like a negative finding, but as far as we're concerned, it's very much a good thing. And also what we looked at, as you might expect, is young people's actual enjoyment of the programme. Did they actually enjoy taking part in this? And the qualitative and the quantitative data would speak to the fact that they really very much did. They enjoyed speaking to the ex-prisoners. They enjoyed the opportunity. The actual programme culminates in a panel discussion where they get to sit with representatives of political ex-prisoners from both sides of the community, and they have the opportunity to talk to them and ask questions. And that was the one thing that the young people very much enjoyed and appreciated. So is there any questions on that so far? No? Happy enough? So I'm going to move on now to talk about some of the qualitative data then. So throughout this you'll see some quotes, which I'm not necessarily going to drag you through all of them. I'll maybe highlight some key issues. But one of the key things that come out of the qualitative data, we did interviews and focus groups with a lot of the young people involved. And what we found is they very much, as I've just said, they enjoyed engaging with the narratives of the ex-prisoners. They really appreciated how these were first-hand accounts. They would say things like, you know, our history teacher, he maybe wasn't there, but these guys that are talking to us, they were there. They really began to appreciate the reality of it. And they also appreciated learning about the impact of being involved in violence, so very much around prison life. They were really intrigued around that, but more so the effect that it had on families. So I'll draw your attention then to that last quote there, where the kid says, it makes you recognise that what actually happened and what happened to the families and stuff like that, the aftermath of it. So they really began to appreciate that the impact wasn't just on the ex-prisoner or on the people that maybe were suffered or bereavement. It had this wider impact on the families and all the communities around them. They also acknowledged a range of benefits that they felt that the programme held for them. So they appreciated themselves, that they felt it increased their own knowledge and awareness of the reality and the complexity of the conflict. And they felt that it helped them make sense of their current socio-political context and helped them see how society could move forward. So again, one of the quotes there says, I think it's important because it gets rid of the prejudices we have against certain groups of people and the stories that we've heard from the Troubles. But what the Prison to Peace, that programme, you were able to see both sides of the story, so you could see what actually happened. A lot of what the young people were talking about was the one-sidedness that they were experiencing. They were hearing stories from their family, their friends within their communities, and they appreciated that maybe what they were getting was a biased, one-sided account. And they trusted their teachers to give them a balanced account, and they trusted the fact that because the programme in itself presents both those narratives, that they valued the fact that they were getting both sides of the story. We also spoke to the teachers in terms of what their views on the programme were, and we spoke to school leaders, so principals and vice principals. And we found that school leaders and teachers in the intervention schools, they also recognised the educational benefits of Prison to Peace. They saw it as providing opportunities to challenge the myths associated with the conflict, to help young people make sense of their socio-political context, and to help them develop their own perspectives. So giving them all the information they needed to then develop their own viewpoint and have the confidence and capacity around that. However, it is important to note that the schools that were involved in this trial were clearly ready to engage with these sort of controversial and sensitive issues. A big part of the data was around this whole readiness to engage with these controversial issues, and what that tended to look like was very much an ethos in the school that was concerned with the holistic development of the child and not just the academic development. It was a school that was like connected to their community, and school where there was great trust between the school leaders, the teachers, the kids, the parents, and backwards again, you know, there was a real sense of trust there as well. So it is very important to highlight that this isn't a programme that went out cold into just any old school. The schools were all trained around the programme, and the schools themselves were, as we would consider, ready to engage with these sorts of controversial topics. Parents as well. Unfortunately, we didn't get to speak to as many parents as we would have liked to, but nonetheless, we got some insight and certainly those that we did get to speak to admitted their apprehension around the programme in the first instance. You have this parent here saying, well, I signed the permission form, so for the panel, the schools would have sent out a consent form to make sure that the parents were happy for their children to go and engage and talk to political ex-prisoners. So she says I had no issue signing it because I have great faith and the schools knows what it's at. And I thought, no, that's fine, even though part of me thought, oh God. So this exemplifies this issue of trust and the connectedness to the community, that the parents trusted that the schools knew what they were doing, but they were very happy to admit that they were still a bit like, oh, and to be fair, some of the children were like that as well. They were a bit apprehensive going into it, but certainly coming out of it, they very much appreciated it. So in particular, the parents recognised the value of their children learning about their socio-historical context from engaging with these ex-prisoners, and they welcomed the dialogue that it created between them and their children about the troubles and the current nature of Northern Irish society. This sort of intergenerational dialogue was recognised by the children as well, where they were saying, I went home and I asked my daddy about this, or I asked my granda, and it was creating that sort of conversation at home as well. I think that's me back to you, Lesley, with the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Just to pull together a few conclusions now, there was so much data in this and there's so many connections that can be made, and we do have some copies of the full report and some executive summaries of the research for anybody who wants a copy of those, and we can certainly send more information to people. But I suppose in the context of what we're talking about today, there's a couple of things that come out of this that are interesting for us. Young people are clearly interested in learning about the recent past, and they are not really being afforded opportunities to do so in school in the way in which they want to. It tends to be quite glossed over in schools. But not only are they interested in it, they're ready to engage with its controversies. One of the things that was interesting in these kind of discourses of trust that went throughout the school, the children talked about trust in the teachers, all the adults talked about trust in each other, nobody talked about trust in the children. And I think that's quite telling, that at no point did the adults say that they trusted the children to actually engage with these issues. In fact, if anything, they were concerned that the children maybe weren't ready. And yet what was really obvious from the work that we were doing with these young people is that they are very ready and keen to engage with the controversies, and keen as well to engage with some of the dissonance that it creates in their own minds, where we had young people saying, this is hard, it's really confusing, because when you see what your community has done to another community, or when you realise that there's another side, there's another story, they were finding it hard and confusing, but they wanted to do it and they were ready for it. I think that one of the things that comes through for us, particularly in the idea of educational programmes and programmes that are designed in this kind of intervention way to try and challenge attitudes and behaviours in young people, quite often what we do and what we see in education is programmes that deal with the here and now, that deal with the diversity that exists now and deal with understanding each other in this context, but they don't connect our current context to the recent past. And whilst this programme did not set out to specifically challenge sectarian prejudice, it did so significantly. It was one of the most significant findings. And in the qualitative work that we did with the young people, it was really apparent that it was their understanding of the past helped them make sense of the division in this society and made them more sensitive to those issues and more understanding of others and their perspectives. And I know we've talked about both sides in a very kind of crude way here, but it was that kind of complexity of many stories, many narratives, many ways in which people had experienced the conflict. I think it's also important at this point to say that when you go in with the narratives of those who were directly involved in violence in loyalist and Republican groups, it can be seen to be glamorising or glorifying what happened, and that was not the initiative of that programme at all. But one of the things that's very interesting is that you cannot go in and talk about Republican and loyalists who were involved in the conflict without talking about everybody else. Without talking about victims of the conflict and what does that mean and how do we transition to peace. So this programme, by going in with, I suppose, the most controversial narratives, opened up for the young people all other stories and all other narratives. And that's one of the things that we are particularly interested in, is how do we engage with a range of different narratives around the conflict to help young people try to make sense and try to position themselves within these very complex stories. We know the programme itself has had a significant positive impact on young people. And that was the reason why we conducted the research in the way that we did, because we wanted to be sure that this programme was having a positive effect on young people, and in particular in relation to their support for violence and in their intention to become politically engaged. And those findings were very, very encouraging. We have a number of recommendations coming out of the research in relation to how the programme goes forward. For example, programme needs to work with other programmes, needs to engage with other narratives, as I said, to give the young people as broad a picture as possible. But one of the things that we would say in terms of policy priorities is that, without going through each of these, there is something about the way in which we address anti-sectarianism in our programmes in schools that we need to think about, and we need to start to make stronger connections between the recent past, the legacy of conflict, and the type of society we have now, because in this programme that seemed to be what was challenging the young people's perspectives on the communities that they were in now. And I suppose in terms of policy, we would see this as sitting very firmly within the community relations policy within education, and would hope that on the back of this, schools will not only engage with this type of programme, but engage with the range of programmes that are available to help young people make sense of the past and their current context. Okay, thank you.